Hey, what's up guys, this is DarkArmedDuelist, and today I'm doing an Infernoid deck profile. So this deck is a really interesting deck that if you guys have never played around with it, basically it banishes a bunch of monsters from the graveyard that are Infernoid monsters, especially some of the really big ones, to be able to go off with all sorts of different awesome plays, like banishing or destroying all monsters on your opponent's side of the field, or destroying all spell and traps on your opponent's side of the field. So without further ado guys, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell on the soon come part of notification squad. Definitely check out the Patreon down in the description because it has some really cool rewards for you guys, like getting your name stripped from every single video, getting a signed card sent to you in the mail, or even getting to request a deck profile just like this one every single month that you are a patron. So let's get straight on into this. So first off, we are playing 2 copies of Infernoid Anunku, which is kind of one of those effects that I was talking about earlier. Infernoid Anunku has the ability that he cannot be special summoned except by special summoning from your hand or graveyard by its own effect, by banishing 3 Infernoid monsters from your hand or graveyard, while you control a total level of less than 8. Of total level of rank or level of 8. So that's why link monsters are really pivotal to this deck, because they don't have a rank, they don't have a level, they just have a link rating. So it kind of bypasses the mechanic of the entire Infernoid deck. So that's something to keep in mind. All of your Infernoids share that ability that you have to have less than 8 on the field, which is kind of interesting. But they also have the ability, this one also has the ability that when this card is special summoned, you can destroy all other monsters on the field, and then once per turn, during either player's turn, when a spell trap is activated, you can tribute a monster to negate the activation, and if you do, banish that card, which is really good. Then we play 2 copies of Infernoid Deviati. Infernoid Deviati is a really good card because what Deviati does is exactly the same thing as Anunku, except when this card is special summoned, you destroy all spell or traps on the field, except for void cards, which is kind of like their spells and traps. All their spells and traps are void spells and traps, like Void Imagination, Void Vanishment, and even the new Void Apocalypse, which is the new card that we have, and Void Feast. Then it also has the ability that instead of negating spells and traps, you can tribute a monster to negate the activation of a monster effect that's activated. So basically these two are exact polar opposites in those terms, which is really neat. Then I play 1 copy of Ontadel. Ontadel can attack twice, which is super neat, but you only have to banish 2 Infernoids to special summon your Ontadel, which is a really neat effect. It has the ability also that when this card destroys an opponent's monster at battle and sends it to the graveyard, you can activate this effect. This card can make a second attack in a row. And then the majority of your Infernoids share the ability that once per turn, during either player's turn, you can tribute a monster to target a card in your opponent's graveyard and banish it. So they're all kind of like DD Crow effects, which is pretty cool. I play 2 copies of Infernoid Semestus. Semestus is really cool because when it battles, if this card attacks an opponent's monster, this effect can be activated at the end of the battle phase to banish a card on the field, and then once per turn, you can also tribute a card to target a card on the field, or target a card in your opponent's graveyard and banish it. But if you have Lair of Darkness on the field, you can tribute one of your opponent's monsters to banish one of their cards in the graveyard, which is kind of neat. It also has the ability that you have to banish 2 monsters to special summon this card, and it shares the ability of not being able to special summon itself if you don't have that, if you have more than 8 stars or rank on the field, or combined total. We play a single copy of Sajet. Sajet is really cool because it has the ability that if this card battles, you can banish a monster from your opponent's extra deck, and then it shares the ability that you can tribute another card on the field, or tribute a monster on the field to target card in your opponent's graveyard and banish it. But this card comes in really handy because it's special summonable with your copy of Void Feast. You special summon this and 2 copies of Decatron to your side of the field because it special summons up to level 8, which is really cool, and you basically just summon 2 Decatrons, which are level 1s, and then a Sajet, which is a level 6, and it's a combo piece essentially for Void Feast. But if you're going to special summon this card, normally you have to banish 2 Infernoids from the graveyard. 2 copies of Petrulia. Any of the level 4 and lower ones, you just have to banish 1 monster, and they also share the ability that you can tribute a monster to target a card in the graveyard and banish it, and they're all quick effects, which is really cool. But Petrulia is a MST that when it's special summoned, or once per turn, you can target a spell or trap on the field and destroy it, but it can't attack the turn you activate the effect. We play 2 copies of Harmonic. Harmonic is basically the exact same thing, except you can destroy a monster on the field, which is really cool, but it can't attack the turn you activate the effect. 2 copies of Antra. Antra is really neat as well because it bounces a monster on the field because you can target a face-up card your opponent controls. Return to the hand, which is really cool to be able to just banish something that they had put a lot of commitment into or something, and then during your opponent's turn, you can treat a monster, then target one card to your opponent's graveyard and banish it, and it's a quick effect. And then 3 of the best card in the entire deck, and that is 3 copies of Infernoid Decatron. This card is insane in the deck. As you can see, everything else is either a 1 or a 2 of, but Decatron is a 3 of. This card is basically what the entire deck is focused around, that if this card is normal or special summoned, you get to send an Infernoid from your deck to the graveyard, except another copy of itself. And if you do, you increase this card's level by the level of the monster sent. And if you do, this card's name and original effect become the monster that you send to the graveyard. So what you always want to do is send your copy of Anunku and Deviati to the graveyard so you can treat a monster or treat a monster to negate a monster effect or a spell and trap effect, depending on which Decatron you have on the field, especially with Void Feast, because you're getting to tribute your opponent's monsters if you have Lair of Darkness on the field too, which is really, really, really cool. So that's it for the monsters, guys. Let's get into the spells. So for the spells, we're playing quite a few spells in the deck. We're playing a single copy of 1 for 1. 1 for 1 really helps out because you have to tribute a monster, or send a monster from your hand to the graveyard, which all of your monsters like being in the graveyard because they're easily being banished or special summoned back from the graveyard. All the level 5 and higher ones can be special summoned back from the graveyard. The level 4 and lower ones cannot be special summoned from the graveyard. So you always want to discard one of your level 5 or higher ones like Semestus, Antidel, Anunku, Deviatis, Jet. Those, you want to send those to the graveyard to activate your 1 for 1, because then you can special summon Decatron directly from the deck and then send another one to the graveyard like Anunku or Deviati to be able to trigger their effects to negate something or tribute a monster on the field. 1 copy of Card Destruction. Card Destruction is really nice because you don't really care if your cards are in the graveyard. You just don't. This card's really nice to be able to refill your hand, dig through your deck to get what you need, but I really like Card Destruction as one of in here. 1 copy of Terraforming. Terraforming is really neat because it can search your copy of Lair of Darkness, which is a really pivotal card in this deck. 1 copy of Reasoning. If your opponent knows how Infernoids play, they're always going to call 1, but that's not why you play this card. You play this card to send the Infernoids to grave, which is the big reason you play this card at 1. 3 copies of Monster Gate. Monster Gate's insane in this deck because you just tribute a monster on the field. If you have Lair of Darkness, you can tribute your opponent's monster, which is kind of cool. I really like that effect. It's just really, really cool to be able to tribute your opponent's monsters to trigger off your copy of Monster Gate or other monster effects that you're trying to trigger. And then you basically hit cards off the top of your deck, mill them off the deck until you hit a copy of Decatron, because you don't play anything else that can work with it. And then we play 3 copies of Lair of Darkness. Lair of Darkness makes everything dark, and it also has the ability that once per turn, if you attribute a monster you control to activate a card effect, you can attribute a dark monster your opponent controls, even though you don't control it. So basically, all of your cards become dark, or everything becomes dark, and all of your opponent's monsters become dark, so you can attribute those monsters to trigger the effects. Really cool. Makes it so you can tribute off of these effects to be able to trigger it, makes it so you can trigger off Monster Gate to trigger their effects, and it's just really, really, really good. Then we play 3 of the new Void Apocalypse. Void Apocalypse is a neat card. I really like this card at 3 because it has the ability that you can discard a card to send a Fiend monster from your deck to the graveyard, which is always going to be just a copy of any. It can be any of your Anunku or Deviati, because you want to have Anunku and Deviati in the graveyard as quickly as possible. But it also has the ability that you can send it from your spell and trap card zone to the graveyard, and then you send any number of Infernoid monsters to the graveyard with different names equal to the number of monsters your opponent controls that were special summoned from the extra deck. I really like that effect because it helps out just getting those monsters into the graveyard to be able to basically special summon out your copies of Anunku and Deviati. And if you're in a losing position, then this card can help you recover that, because it can get you an Anunku or Deviati to be able to destroy either all the monsters on the field or all the spell and traps on the field. 3 copies of Void Vanishment. Void Vanishment is really cool because it lets you discard a card to add a Void spell or trap from your deck to your hand, and then also hit you can't normal or special summon for the rest of the turn except for Infernoids, which is not that big of a deal. But then also, if an Infernoid monster you control battles an opponent's monster, after damage calculation, you can send this card to the graveyard to banish both of those monsters. 3 copies of Void Imagination. Void Imagination, Inferno monsters you control that are level 2 or higher become level 1, and all battle damage inflicted to your opponent is halved. You can send this card to the graveyard to fusion summon an Infernoid fusion monster from your extra deck, using monsters from your hand or your side of the field as fusion materials, and if your opponent controls a monster that was special summoned from the extra deck, and you don't, you can also send 6 monsters from your deck as fusion materials as well. So it just massive Foolish Burials your deck to go into your Terra, to be able to just fusion summon in this card using 6 materials from your deck to get you all sorts of advantage, which is really cool. Then we play 3 copies of Super Polymerization because it works with the Lair of Darkness. You can play evenly matched in this place if you want to play evenly matched instead of Super Poly, but those are the 2 suggestions that I have for this position. I don't recommend Call by the Grave for this deck because this deck doesn't need it, because it doesn't matter. You're not searching all that much through this deck. You're just trying to banish as much as you can. Just for decks that search a lot, you want to play Call by the Grave. So that's it for the spells, guys. Let's get into the solo trap that we play in the entire deck, which is a single copy of Void Feast. Void Feast is a really neat card that lets you send a Void spell or trap from your hand or from your side of the field to the graveyard to special summon up to 3 Infernoid monsters from your deck whose exact level equal 8 total. So you special summon 2 copies of your Decatron, and 1 copy of Sajet is what you always summon off of this, and then your 2 copies of Decatron trigger sending your copies of Anunku and Deviati to the graveyard, which then makes it so you can negate monster effects and spells and traps, which is really helpful. Something to keep in mind though, it does increase their levels, so you can't special summon anything else, but you can always use them as link material as well, which is kind of neat. And if you've got Lair of Darkness on the field, you can tribute your opponent's monsters to trigger each one of their effects, which is cool. So that's it for the main deck, guys. Let's get into the extra deck. So for the extra deck, we're going to be playing 3 copies of Infernoid Terra. So she's really good because you really want to go into this card as much as possible, because it just takes an Infernoid, Anunku, or Deviati to go into this card, which is something that you need to keep in mind when you're fusion summoning this card using your copy of Void Imagination. But it also has the ability that when this card is fusion summoned, you can apply these effects in sequence depending on the number of fusion materials with different names used for this card summon. If you have 3 or more, each player sends 3 cards from their extra deck to the graveyard, which we have plenty of cards in the extra deck that we can send to the graveyard to trigger different effects. If you have 5 or more, each player sends the top 3 cards of their deck to the graveyard. To 8 or more, each player returns 3 cards from their banished cards to their graveyard, and 10 or more, each player sends their entire hand to the graveyard. You're usually only going to get the 5 effect off, the 3 and the 5 effect off, which is totally fine, because we also play some cards in the extra deck that are really, really neat for that particular ability. For Super Poly, we're playing a single copy of Starving Venom Fusion Dragon, just to go into this card if we need to, and a Mud Dragon of the Swamps. These cards are really easy to go into with Super Polymerization, which is just what you need to keep in mind about these 2. Especially with Lair of Darkness on the field, all of your opponent's monsters become dark, so it's really easy to go into Starving Venom and just OTK your opponent. And then 3 copies of Elder Entity Nist. This card is really neat because if you summon the copy of Infernoid Terra, you send these 3 to the graveyard and then pop 3 cards on the field, which is super nice because it can just help you OTK your opponent. And then 1 copy of Cyframe Lord Omega. It depends on what you want to go for. You can send Omega to the graveyard or send Nist to the graveyard to be able to put something from your graveyard back in your deck or something like that. Once returned during your opponent's standby phase, you can target 1 banished card and return it to the graveyard. And if this card is in your graveyard, you can target 1 other card in your graveyard, shuffle both that card and this card into the deck, which is what you really want to do this card, to be able to put the cards back in your graveyard, back in your deck. 1 copy of Topologic Zeroboros. This card banishes, or everything banishes in this deck, and like a lot. So this card's really good as a boss monster in here. It's not super hard to go into because you're going to link climb in this deck a lot anyways. So this card's really good for the deck because you're going to be banishing a bunch of cards anyways. So this card gains 200 attack for each banished card. And if a monster is special summoned to a zone it points to, then it automatically banishes everything on the field, which is totally fine, including itself. But it special summons itself back. It special summons itself back during the next turn after this card was banished during the standby phase, which is fine because you're just going to summon it back and it's going to be bigger than ever. 1 copy of Crusadia Equal Max. You don't play Boral Sword in here because Equal Max is insane enough. Basically what you do with this card is when you make this card, just to give you a quick reference, for every card that it points to, it gains attack equal to those monsters' attacks. So what you do is you put Antidel and Semestus under this card after you link into this card, and this card gets insanely big. This card goes up by, I think it's 54, and it already goes up to 2,000, so it goes up to 74, I believe, if my math is correct. Which is insanely big on its own. And it also lets you tribute a Crusadia or World Legacy card. This card points to target a card in the field and your opponent controls and negate the effect, but you don't play any World Legacies, so it's not that big of a deal. But being able to summon a monster that's that big is just great. But the monsters it points to can't attack, which is not that big of a deal anyways, because they're already DD Crows on the field. You can tribute them to banish something if you need to. Unicorn just to bounce stuff. Phoenix to pop spells and traps. Verte Anaconda to work with Super Poly. This card's really neat because if you don't have Lair of Darkness, you can always go into this card and then fusion summon away your opponent's monster and this to go for it if you need to, which is why I really like Super Poly in here. And then one copy of Linkuriboh just in case you normal summon the Decatron and it gets negated. You just go for Linkuriboh and it makes you be able to go a little bit more defensive. So that's it for the deck, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. It's a really neat deck. I highly recommend that you guys give this deck a try. It's definitely probably a rogue deck to play around with that'll catch a lot of people off guard because they don't really know. Like, a lot of people know of this deck, but they don't know how to deal with it because it doesn't really matter if you call by the grave it. It doesn't matter if you evenly match it. The only way to stop this deck is to lock the entire graveyard down with like an Abyss Dweller or something like that. And not a lot of decks can go into Abyss Dweller that are meta right this minute. So anyways, guys, this is DarkArmedDuelist. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Hit the bell on there so you can become part of the notification squad. And definitely check out the Patreon down in the description. I'll see you guys in the next video. See you around, guys.